Greetings. In this video, I'm going to go over the individual homework writing functions. And in this homework, we're actually implementing two functions, space and discriminant. And what I've done is I've copied and pasted the example calls and the returns as comments over in my program file. And I also started off my program with a summary of what homework it is and the author, which is me. And so I have as much information from the assignment in my program as possible so I can focus on my code and not have to flip back and forth with the assignment very much. The other thing I've brought up is the writing functions tutorial with the examples. I'm going to scroll through the examples. I'm assuming that you're familiar with these and you've read through this example and actually tried it yourself to understand the process. And I'm going to skip right down to the writing your own functions checklist. And so the first step is to understand what it is you're implementing by beginning with an example test case and actually implement that. And so I'm going to try to implement this first example call to help make it easier to align which of these parameters goes with which of these parameters, and so I can better understand what's happening. Okay, so I'm not even going to put a def line in. I'm just going to start writing because I want to use these values to print out this configuration. And what I can see clearly here is that I'm printing out my dashes twice, and my plus is actually getting printed out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, not 7. But the dash dash plus pattern is getting printed out 7 times. So that's going to give me some clues as to what I need to do. Okay, so I'm going to make a loop for I in range 7. I'm just going to start with the pattern that I saw already. And I'm going to print out my dash. And I'm going to end it with the plus. You could also keep the end as an empty string, but then you would have to put the plus in, you'd have to put the plus in over here. Since that's plus plus, and I think that might be more confusing in this context, I'm going to leave it like this and put the plus there. But there's multiple ways that you can successfully go about doing this. Okay, and then what I want to do at the end of the loop is print a blank line, because in my loop I'm not doing so. So let's start with that. Let me run it and let me see what happens. Oops, wrong program. Okay, and so what I can see is, I'm only printing out one dash. Now, if you recall from earlier in the semester when we worked with arithmetic, you can actually multiply strings. And so I can multiply the dash so that it appears twice. Let me try running that. Aha! This looks very, very close to what I want here. All I'm missing is that leading plus. And so I'm going to add that here. And I need to remember to set my end to be empty so that the plus floats right at the beginning of this line. Let's try that. Woohoo! Awesome. So that's phase 1. And this is a foolproof process that you can follow to implement any function. All of the functions I ask you to write, you will have examples that you can start from. And you should, at this stage of the course, have the tools you need to sit down and implement those, even if it's just outputting this much. Now, the next step is, because we've tested the code, we've understand what we have to implement, now what we want to do is start making variables, identifying parameters, and writing the function signature. So I'm going to jump into defining this first line of the function. So def space, and in the description it gave me names. Okay, so we've got num space, num seg, and so I'm just going to use these here, space care, and seg care. Whoops, except I do want to follow the directions properly. Once I have the def line in place, I need to make a couple more changes. I need to indent my function's body. Even though this isn't yet set up to use any of the parameters, I do need to indent it. And then down at the bottom, I am going to call this function. Now I do Does it ask? Yes, create a main function. So I am asked in the assignment to create a main function. So let's go ahead and do that now. Main is traditionally where execution begins. And so this is where I can put some of these example calls to test them and make sure they actually work. In fact, I'm going to put all of them in here now because as soon as my space function is working correctly, I will see it. I will see it. All right, and then the other thing I don't want to forget to do, which I sometimes forget, is to call main at the bottom. And so this is a standard setup for writing a program with many functions, where you call the functions for testing in main, and then you simply call main down below. Okay, so let's run it. Let's see what happens. Okay, so this is good. So I've made 3 calls to space, and they're all the same. They shouldn't be all the same, right? We can see over here that we should be printing different things for these different calls, but right now my function's not making use of the parameters, so this is the correct behavior. So now what I want to do is figure out which of these actual parameters aligns with which of these formal parameters. And if you're unsure from the English description of what each of these formal parameters is, what you can do is use the actual example to help align this. So for example, the last parameter is the plus. Well, let me take the last parameter's name and substitute it in for plus. Okay, let's run it. I shouldn't see any changes to the top line, but I should actually see a star and a pipe showing up in the bottom 2 lines. Let's see if that's happening. Yup, it is. So changes are happening. As soon as I start using my formal parameters in my code and substituting it in, I start to see a result in my output. So let's keep going. So how about the dash? That's another easy one. That's the 3rd parameter, that's space char. So I'm going to substitute that one in. I'm just going to highlight space character and copy and paste it. And I'm going to try and do it for the others. So let's start with the first parameter, 2, num space. I have 1, 2 here. Let's substitute that in. And then finally, the second parameter is numseg. And that was 7. So I go down into my function, I find 7, and I replace it. So you can take advantage of this example and these concrete values to help guide you with which parameters are which. You don't have to understand the words of the problem if you understand the relationship between these parameters and these parameters, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's run it. And if we've done our substitutions correctly, this line will not change, but these 2 lines will match the output that was given, the example output. Let's try it. Ta-da! And now they are working. And this example also illustrates the true power of functions and that we wrote our implementation here. We parameterized it where we took the parameter variables in our function and we substituted them in to make our implementation more general. And now we can use this function definition space to solve lots of different problems and print lots of different things. So it's now a generalized function and it can be reused in many different ways. So now let's go on and look at discriminant. So the space function is what's called a void function. Void functions typically print or display information, whereas discriminant is what's called a fruitful function. In this function, we are asked to return the result under the square root of the quadratic formula. So we are going to be implementing the square root of b squared minus 4ac, not the whole quadratic formula, just the square root portion. So here we are returning the square root. Here, let's see if I paste this in. Nope, okay. We actually have 2 directives. We'll start with one and we'll go from there. All right. So this is what we are trying to do. Let's dive in. So I think in this case it is easier to start with a function def line, But the idea is the same, that we want to really work through the implementation. And if you're having trouble, you can always implement it for one example and then use the substitution process to help you figure out which parameters align with what values in the function's implementation. Okay, so def discriminant A, B, and C. And I want to make sure I'm returning right away. So sometimes I'll return 0, so I'll throw that in there. And in fact, what it's saying is if 4ac is greater than b squared, then return 0. And that would actually be these first two discriminant calls. Oops. So let's put those in and see if we can get these. So these should be 0. Let's see. Well, these are going to work, but not for the right reasons. Uh-oh. Did I not spell discriminant properly? I was a little concerned about that. Let's try this again. Oh, okay. So I'm calling my function, but nothing is outputting. What's going on? Well, with fruitful functions that return values, unless we do something with the value that's returned, nothing's going to happen in our program. So in this case, I also need to print my values for them to show up in the screen below. And as you saw, anyone can forget. All right, so when I'm testing fruitful functions, I want to put a print in main when I call that function. Ta-da! Yay, now that's what I wanted to see. Now I wonder if I can say if 4ac is greater than b squared. That would be cool. So if 4 times a times c is greater than, now b squared, you can use, I believe there is a power or a square function in the math libraries, but Python also has an arithmetic operator for it, star star. So I'm going to take advantage of that. And to test it, I need to return something else. I'll just return A. I can't return 0 because if I want to test this out, I want to return 0 and then something else so I can test to make sure this works. So let's give that a shot. Woohoo! And I'm still returning 0. Awesome. So that's super good news. If I put in the rest of my function calls, I'm just going to try and make this easier for myself by putting the output right here. And I like things all lined up nice and neat. Okay, so then finally I'm going to print. Good, that's substituted in for me. And we want to make sure that our values are approximately the same. Okay, so I'm going to run these. And for the second two, I should not be outputting 0. I should be outputting 12 point something, 11 point something, but what I'm going to be printing here, because I'm just simply returning A right now, is 6 and 4. So I expect to see 0, 0, 6, 4. Good, and I am. So now the question is, can we return the square root of b squared minus 4 times ac? Let's see if we can do that. Okay, so square root is defined in math. So I'm going to import math just so it's there and ready. I put that in the top of my file. And then here I'm going to say math dot square root. And I'm taking the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c. All right, let's see what happens. Woohoo! And it looks like I'm getting the right values here. That is awesome. Some other things I want to note here. You could have an else, but when you're returning in an if, the else is optional. So I can say here that the else is optional. The other thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the order of this program. It begins with a leading comment that summarizes the file, then any imports, then my function definitions, both function definitions, or all of my function definitions, actually I have three here with the main, then lastly, any remaining calls that are unindented. And so this is the best practice for ordering your programs as well, and I do look for that when I'm doing grading. All right, so now it's your turn. Please try this out. If you weren't able to get this on your own, I highly recommend that you look at some of the additional practice problems. There are pages and pages and pages of them. See if you can follow this process and get those working on your own. Take care.